It was St. Patrick's Day in Dublin, and the city was alive with celebration. Tourists and locals alike crowded into pubs, their laughter and voices blending with the sound of fiddles and clinking glasses. Among the revelers was a group of 4 American friends, Daniel, Mark, Lisa, and Emily, who had traveled to Ireland to experience an authentic pub crawl. They started the night at the Brazen Head, Ireland's oldest pub, where they toasted to their adventure with pints of Guinness. As the night wore on, they stumbled from one pub to another, following a loosely planned route. Somewhere along the way, a stranger in a dark green coat approached them. His face was gaunt, his smile unsettling. "You lot looking for a real Irish experience?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the crowd. Daniel, always up for something different, nodded eagerly. "Of course, that's why we're here." The stranger's smile widened. "There's a place, not on any tourist map. You want to see a real Irish pub? Follow me." Something about him was off, but the group was drunk and caught up in the spirit of the night. Without questioning, they followed him down a narrow alleyway. The further they walked, the quieter the streets became. The sounds of Dublin's festivities faded behind them until only the wind whispered through the empty streets. At last, they arrived at an old stone building with a wooden sign above the door. The name was worn away with time. The stranger pushed open the heavy door, and warm, flickering candlelight spilled out. The air inside smelled of aged whiskey and damp wood. The pub was eerily quiet despite being full of patrons. People sat hunched over their drinks, talking in hushed voices. A slow, haunting fiddle tune played from somewhere unseen. The bartender, an older man with hollow eyes, greeted them with a knowing smile. Lisa hesitated. "This place is weird," Mark laughed, nudging her. "Come on, it's just an old-fashioned pub. It's part of the experience." They ordered drinks and found a booth in the corner. The stranger had vanished, and no one had seen him leave. As they drank, a creeping unease settled over them. Emily leaned in. "Has anyone else noticed that no one here is speaking above a whisper?" Daniel shrugged. "Maybe they're just old school." But then, they noticed something stranger. The clock on the wall had not moved since they arrived. The candles never seemed to burn lower, and the faces of the other patrons, though blurred by shadow, looked strangely familiar, as if they had seen them before in old photographs. Lisa gripped Mark's arm. "We should go. Now." Mark, still trying to act brave, waved her off. But when he turned back to his drink, his face paled. His reflection in the bar mirror was missing. Panic surged through them. Daniel stood abruptly. "We're leaving." As they hurried toward the door, the bartender's voice stopped them. "You can't leave." The entire pub fell silent. Every patron turned to stare at them, their hollow eyes glinting in the candlelight. The bartender stepped forward, his smile stretching unnaturally wide. "You've already joined us." The group turned and bolted for the door, yanking it open. Cold night air hit them as they stumbled back onto the cobblestone street. But when they looked back, the pub was gone. In its place stood an abandoned, crumbling building, its windows shattered, its door rotting on its hinges. A plaque on the wall, barely visible in the dim light, read, "McCullen's Pub, established 1832. Closed after the mysterious disappearance of all patrons on St. Patrick's Night, 1903. Their blood ran cold. They ran without stopping, without looking back, until they reached the crowded streets again. No one believed them. No one had ever heard of the pub they described. But when they checked their phones later, their pictures from that night showed something horrifying. In every photo behind them, the shadowy patrons of the vanished pub stared directly at the camera, smiling. It was St. Patrick's Day, and Megan had always been fascinated by Irish folklore. When she stumbled upon an old antique shop in a quiet Dublin alley, she couldn't resist stepping inside. The shop smelled of aged wood and something damp, something ancient. Trinkets and relics cluttered the dimly lit shelves, their golden glints catching the flickering candlelight. An elderly shopkeeper, his eyes milky with age, emerged from the shadows. "Looking for something special, lass?" he rasped. Megan smiled nervously. "Just browsing. I love Irish myths." The old man's cracked lips curled into a knowing grin. "Then perhaps you'd be interested in this." He reached beneath the counter and retrieved a small, delicate locket. When he pried it open, a perfectly preserved 4-leaf clover lay inside. Unlike any Megan had ever seen, its leaves were dark, almost black, as though soaked in ink. "A true rarity," the old man whispered. "A cursed clover, passed down for centuries. Legend says whoever possesses it is granted luck, but at a terrible price." Megan chuckled, thinking it was just a sales tactic. She was a firm skeptic but couldn't deny the eerie charm of the trinket. "How much?" The shopkeeper hesitated. "It's not for sale, but if it has chosen you, it's yours. Just remember, never lose it." A chill ran down Megan's spine as she took the locket. That night, as she celebrated with friends, she kept it close to her chest, amused by the old man's ominous warning. The first stroke of luck came almost immediately. She won a pub raffle, scoring free drinks for the night. Then, as she walked home, she narrowly avoided a speeding car that swerved at the last second. "Maybe this thing really is lucky," she mused. But the luck turned dark the next morning. She awoke to frantic knocking on her door. It was her neighbor, pale and shaking. "Did you hear about Ryan?" he gasped. He was hit by a car last night, right outside this building." Megan froze. She had been walking past that exact spot. Had it been meant for her? Coincidence, surely. But the coincidences continued. That day at work, she got an unexpected promotion. Her boss suddenly stepping down due to a freak accident. As she processed the news, her phone vibrated. Another friend, someone who had been with her at the pub the night before, had fallen down the stairs, breaking their leg. Her hands trembled as she clutched the locket. Was it truly luck, or something else? Determined to rid herself of it, she returned to the antique shop. But when she arrived, the alley was different. The shop was gone. In its place stood only a bricked-up doorway, its edges blackened with age. No sign, no trace that it had ever existed. Megan's heart pounded. Desperate, she tried to discard the locket, throwing it into the river. Yet that night, she woke to find it on her nightstand, damp, as if retrieved from the water. Then the nightmares began. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision. Whispers crept through the silence, hissing her name. And always, in her dreams, she saw the old shopkeeper's face, watching, grinning. One by one, the people closest to her suffered strange misfortunes. A friend's house burned down. A coworker suffered a stroke. Megan stopped answering calls, isolating herself in fear. The weight of the locket around her neck felt heavier each day. She spent hours researching folklore, desperate for an answer. Hidden in an obscure forum, she found a chilling passage. The Cursed Clover bestows great fortune, but for each stroke of luck, another must suffer. To be free, one must pass it on, willingly accepted, never stolen, never lost. Megan's stomach twisted. The shopkeeper hadn't sold it to her. He had given it to her. The cycle had to continue. That night, she went to a crowded bar and struck up conversation with a tourist. She told him a charming story about an Irish lucky charm. He laughed, intrigued, as she placed the locket in his palm. As she walked away, she heard his voice behind her. "Hey, you forgot this." She turned with a forced smile. "No, it's yours now." The moment he tucked it into his pocket, an immense weight lifted from Megan's shoulders. The whispers stopped. The air felt lighter. As she stepped onto the bustling streets, she felt free for the first time in weeks. But deep down, she knew, somewhere the curse had begun anew. Liam had always hated the quiet countryside of his grandfather's farm. Every year, his family insisted on visiting for St. Patrick's Day, and every year, he dreaded the long, boring days spent in the middle of nowhere. This time, however, something felt different. The air was colder, the fields eerily silent, and his grandfather seemed uneasy. "You stay out of the old Shamrock Field, boy," his grandfather warned on the first night. "There's something there that doesn't take kindly to strangers." Liam scoffed at the superstition but couldn't ignore the strange look in his grandfather's eyes. The old man was serious. That night, as the wind howled through the farmhouse, Liam heard something. A whisper, faint, almost melodic, weaving through the rustling of the trees. He sat up in bed, listening. The sound was coming from outside. Curiosity got the best of him. Pulling on his coat, he stepped out into the chilly night. The moon cast an eerie glow over the fields, illuminating the rolling hills in a pale, ghostly light. The Shamrock Field lay beyond the barn, untouched, overgrown, and strangely darker than the rest of the landscape. As he neared, the whispers grew louder. They weren't carried by the wind, they were coming from the ground. A chill ran down his spine, but Liam pressed on. His foot hit something solid. He looked down and saw a stone slab, partially covered by the dense shamrocks. Kneeling, he brushed them aside and found an inscription worn with time. "Here lies the unseen one. May it never wake." His breath hitched. The whispers turned to laughter, low, guttural, and wrong. The shamrocks around him began to wither, curling into blackened husks. Something moved beneath him. Liam scrambled backward as the ground shifted, as if something beneath was stirring. A skeletal hand shot through the dirt, fingers grasping at the night air. He let out a strangled cry as more emerged, arms, faces, hollow eyes filled with an unnatural hunger. He ran. The laughter chased him, a chorus of unseen mouths mocking his terror. He didn't stop until he reached the farmhouse, slamming the door behind him. His grandfather was already waiting, his face grim. "You woke it, didn't you?" I didn't mean to," Liam stammered. The old man sighed, gripping Liam's shoulders. "Listen to me, boy. You have to end it before sunrise." Liam's stomach twisted. "How?" His grandfather handed him an old lantern and a bundle of dried herbs. "Go back. Burn the shamrocks. Seal the ground." Every fiber of his being screamed at him to refuse, but the weight in his grandfather's gaze left no room for argument. With shaking hands, he returned to the field. The ground pulsed like a living thing, and the whispers had grown into a deafening cacophony. He struck a match, dropping it onto the dried herbs. The fire roared to life, its glow unnatural, hungry. The earth trembled as the flames consumed the shamrocks. A piercing shriek filled the air. Shadows writhed, twisting and clawing as if in agony. The ground buckled, then caved in on itself, dragging the horrors back into the abyss. Then silence. The fire died out, leaving only scorched earth and the heavy scent of something ancient and angry. The whispers were gone. Liam staggered back to the farmhouse, where his grandfather waited. "It's done." Liam nodded, his hands still trembling. His grandfather exhaled, eyes filled with sorrow. "Until the next fool wakes it." The next morning, Liam left the farm without looking back, vowing never to return. But as the car rumbled down the dirt road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, he saw the shamrocks blooming once more. Daniel and Aaron had always loved the thrill of exploring abandoned places. Every St. Patrick's Day, they made it a tradition to find a new haunted location and test their bravery. This year, their research led them to Blackthorn Swamp, a desolate marshland on the outskirts of town, where an old legend spoke of a cursed scarecrow that guarded the land. "They say it moves when you're not looking," Aaron read aloud from an online forum as they drove through the misty backroads. "And if it ever turns to face you, you don't get to leave." Daniel chuckled nervously. "That's just a story, right?" The road leading to the swamp was barely visible through the thick fog. Trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. As they neared their destination, an eerie silence settled over the woods. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant sound of water bubbling somewhere deep in the marsh. They parked near an old fence, the wood rotting and covered in moss. Beyond it lay a vast expanse of marshland, its tall grass swaying despite the absence of wind. A narrow dirt path wound its way through the reeds, leading toward a single, lonely figure in the distance. The scarecrow, dressed in tattered clothes, its burlap sack head was tilted slightly downward, its stitched mouth twisted into a crooked smile. The wooden post it was nailed to was splintered and old, as if it had been there for centuries. But what sent a shiver down Aaron's spine were the eyes, two hollow, black voids that seemed to drink in the moonlight. Daniel took a step forward, raising his camera. "Let's get a closer look." As they approached, something moved in the corner of Aaron's vision, a shadow darting through the reeds. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the mist, but there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" Daniel asked, lowering his camera. A cold gust of wind suddenly rushed past them, carrying a faint whisper, low, unintelligible, but undeniably there. The reeds around them rustled, though the air had gone still once more. Daniel hesitated. "Maybe we should." A loud snap echoed from behind them. They whirled around. The scarecrow had turned. His head was no longer tilted downward. It was now looking straight at them. Aaron gasped, stumbling backward. "No way. That wasn't like that before." Daniel's hands trembled as he pointed his camera at it. "Maybe the wind." The scarecrow twitched. Not the wind. Not their imagination. It moved. Without thinking, they bolted. The reeds closed in around them as they sprinted back toward the car, the ground sucking at their feet like quicksand. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, chanting. Shadows darted through the fog, watching, waiting. Then Aaron tripped. Daniel skidded to a stop, turning back. "Get up!" She looked up, and her heart nearly stopped. The scarecrow was closer. It now stood just a few feet away, its head tilted once more, but this time the crooked smile had widened. The stitches had begun to fray, revealing something writhing beneath the burlap. Aaron screamed. Daniel yanked her to her feet, and they ran harder than ever before. The whispers turned to laughter, guttural and inhuman, echoing from every direction. The trees twisted, their branches reaching for them like skeletal hands. The ground beneath them shifted as if something was writhing just below the surface. The car. It was so close. They reached it, fumbling with the doors, throwing themselves inside. Daniel turned the key, nothing. He tried again. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Then came the tapping. Slow, rhythmic, scraping against the window. Erin refused to look. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering a prayer, while Daniel's breath came in panicked gasps. The tapping stopped. For a moment, silence. Then the car lights flickered. Through the rearview mirror, Daniel saw it. The scarecrow was right behind them, standing in the middle of the road, its burlap sack head now split open. Inside, something pulsed. A twisted, gaping maw filled with rotting teeth, its hollow eyes bleeding black ichor. Daniel slammed his fist against the dashboard. "Come on! Come on!" The car roared to life. They didn't hesitate. Daniel floored it, tires screeching as they peeled away, leaving the scarecrow behind. But the laughter followed them, growing fainter but never truly fading. They didn't stop driving until they reached the highway, where the lights of civilization welcomed them back to reality. Only then did they dare to breathe. Aaron shuddered. "We're never talking about this again." Daniel nodded, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "Agreed." The next morning, they checked the footage on Daniel's camera. The scarecrow was in every shot, even the ones where it shouldn't have been.